What happens when the person you trust the most, the one who helped you build an empire from the ground up, becomes the architect of your downfall? What dark secrets can fester in the shadows of immense wealth and power? Today, we delve into a story of ambition, betrayal, and a crime that shook the very foundations of the corporate world. But before we unravel this gripping tale of greed and deception, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you don't miss out on our weekly explorations into the darkest corners of human nature. Now, let's begin. The city of Lumina was a monument to ambition, its skyline a jagged testament to the fortunes won and lost within its gleaming towers. And no one, it seemed, had won more spectacularly than Julian Croft. His company, Helios Innovations, was the sun around which the city's tech industry orbited. From sleek, minimalist smartphones that were extensions of one's very thoughts to revolutionary clean energy solutions that promised a greener future, Helios was at the apex of modern ingenuity. Julian, with his sharp suits, sharper mind, and a smile that could disarm the most hardened investors, was the living embodiment of his company's success. He was the golden boy of Lumina, a visionary who had not just climbed the ladder of success, but had built a new one entirely. By his side always was Marcus Thorne. If Julian was the charismatic face of Helios, Marcus was its unflappable, brilliant core. A master of logistics and operations, he was the one who translated Julian's grand visions into tangible, world-changing realities. They were a perfect partnership, a symphony of creativity and execution. They had met in a cramped college dorm room, fueled by cheap coffee and audacious dreams. Their bond was forged in the fires of all-night coding sessions, rejections from venture capitalists, and the shared, unshakable belief that they were destined for greatness. And they had achieved it. Their story was the stuff of legends, a modern-day fable of friendship and entrepreneurial triumph. The public saw them as inseparable, two sides of the same golden coin. They graced the covers of business magazines, their interviews filled with mutual admiration and a shared vision for the future. Julian, with his easy charm and eloquent speeches, would often say, "I'm just the dreamer. Marcus is the one who makes the dreams come true." And Marcus, ever the pragmatist, would retort with a wry smile, "Someone has to keep his head out of the clouds and his feet on the ground." Their dynamic was a well-oiled machine, and Helios Innovations was its magnificent creation. But within the gilded cage of their success, tiny, almost invisible cracks were beginning to form. The pressure at the top was immense, a constant, crushing weight that few could truly comprehend. The Julian that the world saw was a carefully constructed persona, a mask of effortless brilliance that hid a growing exhaustion. The endless meetings, the relentless demand for innovation, the constant scrutiny of the media and the market, it was a relentless onslaught. He found himself increasingly reliant on Marcus, not just for the operational side of the business, but for the emotional fortitude to keep going. Marcus was his rock, the one person who understood the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the gnawing fear of failure that lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. Marcus, for his part, was a man of quiet complexities. While Julian basked in the limelight, Marcus found his satisfaction in the intricate dance of numbers, the elegant efficiency of a well-run supply chain, the silent hum of a company operating at peak performance. He was a master of the behind-the-scenes machinations, the invisible hand that guided Helios with a steady, unwavering grip. He didn't crave the adulation that Julian seemed to thrive on, or so he told himself. But a seed of resentment had taken root in the fertile ground of his understated brilliance. It was a subtle, insidious thing, a whisper in the back of his mind that grew louder with each standing ovation for Julian, each fawning article that painted him as a lone genius. The first tangible sign of a fracture appeared during the Project Chimera negotiations. It was their most ambitious undertaking yet, a revolutionary AI-driven logistics network that promised to redefine global commerce. The deal was with a notoriously aggressive conglomerate, Omnicorp, and the negotiations were brutal. Julian, with his characteristic optimism, was ready to concede on several key points to secure the partnership. He saw the bigger picture, the long-term potential of their combined forces. Marcus, however, was a man of details, and he saw a trap. He argued that Omnicorp was trying to absorb their proprietary technology, to gut Helios from the inside out. Their disagreements, once confined to the sterile environment of the boardroom, began to spill over into their personal interactions. Late-night arguments in their shared penthouse office, once a space of collaborative energy, became tense and strained. "You're being paranoid, Marcus," Julian would say, his voice laced with a weariness that went beyond the late hour. "This is how the game is played. You have to give a little to get a lot." "And what exactly are we getting, Julian?" Marcus would counter, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "A fancy press release and a knife in our back a year from now? We built this from nothing. Are you really willing to sell its soul for a quick win?" The argument over Project Chimera escalated, becoming a symbol of a deeper, unspoken rift between them. Julian, feeling the weight of his public persona, saw Marcus's caution as a lack of faith, a betrayal of their shared ambition. Marcus, in turn, saw Julian's eagerness to close the deal as a sign of recklessness, a willingness to gamble with the empire they had so painstakingly built. The easy camaraderie that had once defined their relationship was replaced by a brittle tension, a sense of two tectonic plates grinding against each other, the pressure building towards an inevitable earthquake. Unbeknownst to Julian, Marcus had begun to take matters into his own hands. He started having discreet meetings, late-night phone calls that were conspicuously absent from his official calendar. He was a man who believed in contingencies, in having a plan B, C, and D. He told himself it was for the good of the company, a way to protect Helios from Julian's increasingly impulsive decisions. But there was a thrill in the secrecy, a sense of power in operating in the shadows. He was no longer just the co-pilot. He was charting his own course, navigating treacherous waters that Julian wasn't even aware of. He began to cultivate a network of contacts, individuals who, like him, preferred the quiet corridors of power to the glaring spotlight. There were clandestine meetings in dimly lit bars, encrypted emails exchanged in the dead of night. He learned of hidden loopholes in their contracts, of backdoors in their financial systems, of vulnerabilities that only a man with his intimate knowledge of the company could exploit. It started as a defensive measure, a way to gather leverage in his ongoing battle of wills with Julian. But the more he delved into the underbelly of the corporate world, the more he found himself seduced by its dark allure. Greed, he was discovering, was a far more potent motivator than he had ever imagined. The day of the incident began like any other in the rarefied air of Helios Innovations. The sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the city as it rose, its golden light glinting off the floor-to-ceiling windows of Julian's penthouse office. He had been up for hours, a habit he had developed in the early days of the company, a belief that the world belonged to those who greeted the dawn. He was on a conference call with their Tokyo office, his voice a smooth, confident melody as he outlined their expansion plans for the Asian market. He was in his element, a conductor orchestrating a global symphony of commerce. Marcus arrived shortly after, his face an unreadable mask. He placed a steaming cup of Julian's favorite single-origin coffee on the polished mahogany desk, a ritual they had maintained for years. But today, there was a subtle, almost imperceptible change in his demeanor. The easy banter that usually accompanied their morning routine was absent, replaced by a terse, "We need to talk." Julian ended his call, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Can it wait, Marcus? I'm in the middle of closing the Tokyo deal." "No," Marcus said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "It can't." The conversation that followed was the culmination of months of simmering resentment and unspoken frustrations. Marcus laid out his objections to the Omnicorp deal in stark, uncompromising terms. He presented evidence of their predatory business practices, of companies they had acquired and then dismantled, of promises broken and partners discarded. He spoke of the risks, the potential for catastrophic failure, the loss of everything they had worked for. Julian listened, his initial annoyance giving way to a growing anger. He saw Marcus's arguments not as a genuine concern for the company, but as a personal attack, a challenge to his authority. "You're a pessimist, Marcus," he said, his voice rising. You always have been. You're so afraid of losing what we have that you're blind to what we could become. And you're a gambler, Julian. Marcus shot back, his composure finally cracking. You're so addicted to the applause that you're willing to bet the entire company on a long shot. The argument escalated, their voices echoing in the cavernous office. It was a brutal, ugly affair, the kind of fight that can only happen between two people who know each other's deepest insecurities and vulnerabilities. Words were wielded like weapons, years of shared history twisted into accusations and recriminations. The camaraderie that had been the bedrock of their partnership crumbled, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound. And then, in the heat of the moment, Julian said something that would forever alter the course of their lives. Maybe you're right, Marcus. Maybe I am a gambler. But at least I'm not a coward, hiding in the shadows, afraid to take a risk. Maybe the problem isn't the deal. Maybe the problem is you. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Marcus's face, which had been flushed with anger, went pale. A strange, unnerving calm settled over him. He looked at Julian, his eyes cold and distant, as if seeing him for the first time. The silence that followed was more deafening than their shouting had been. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of their shared past and the chilling premonition of a dark, uncertain future. The rest of the day passed in a blur of strained civility. They attended meetings, they answered emails, they went through the motions of their partnership. But the chasm that had opened between them was too wide to be bridged. The trust that had once been the cornerstone of their relationship was shattered, replaced by a cold, unsettling suspicion. That evening, Julian was working late, a common occurrence. He was trying to salvage the Omnicorp deal to prove to Marcus and to himself that he was right. The office was quiet, the only sounds the gentle hum of the servers and the distant murmur of the city below. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't hear Marcus enter the room. He looked up, startled, as Marcus approached his desk. I thought you'd gone home, he said, his voice betraying a hint of his lingering anger. I needed to clear my head, Marcus said, his voice strangely subdued. I went for a walk. He was holding a small, ornate letter opener, one that Julian had given him as a gift years ago, a memento from a trip to Florence. He ran his thumb along its gilded edge, his gaze fixed on its sharp, pointed tip. Look, Marcus, Julian began, his tone softening slightly. About this morning, I was out of line. We're both under a lot of pressure. You're right, Julian, Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. We are. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving the letter opener. You've always been the visionary, the one who sees the big picture. And I've always been the one who has to deal with the messy details. And you're brilliant at it, Julian said, a genuine note of admiration in his voice. We wouldn't be here without you. No, Marcus said, a strange, sad smile playing on his lips. We wouldn't. He took another step and then another until he was standing right beside Julian's chair. The thing about details, Julian, he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper, is that you have to pay attention to them. You have to see what's right in front of you. And then, with a swift, brutal motion, he plunged the letter opener into Julian's side. The pain was a blinding, white-hot explosion. Julian gasped, a strangled, incredulous sound. He looked down and saw the gilded handle of the letter opener protruding from his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. A dark, crimson stain was spreading rapidly, a stark, obscene flower blooming on the pristine white fabric. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, pain, and a dawning horrific understanding. Marcus's face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. The resentment that had been festering for years had finally erupted, a volcanic, unstoppable force. You should have listened to me, Julian, he said, his voice as sharp and as cold as the steel he had just driven into his partner's body. You should have listened. He pulled the letter opener out with a sickening, tearing sound. Julian cried out, a raw, agonized sound that was quickly muffled as he slumped forward, his head hitting the polished surface of his desk with a dull, heavy thud. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was Marcus's face. No longer the face of his friend, his partner, his brother, but the face of a stranger, a betrayer, a man consumed by a greed and a rage that he had never known existed. The gilded cage had become a tomb, and the architect of his success had become the angel of his death. Or so it seemed. The city of Lumina, for all its light, was about to be plunged into a very dark and twisted night. The sun of Helios Innovations had been eclipsed, and the shadows were just beginning to lengthen. Detective Miles Corbin was a man who preferred the city's grit to its glamour. He was a creature of the rain-slicked streets and shadowed alleys, a man who understood the darkness that festered beneath Lumina's polished veneer. He had seen it all in his 20 years on the force. Crimes of passion, crimes of desperation, crimes of pure, unadulterated evil. So when he was called to the pristine, opulent crime scene at Helios Innovations, he felt a familiar sense of weary resignation. The rich, he had long ago concluded, just had more expensive ways of killing each other. The penthouse office was a sterile, almost clinical environment, a stark contrast to the brutal act of violence that had occurred within its walls. The forensic team moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, their white suits a ghostly presence in the morning light. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the faint, coppery tang of blood. Corbin stood in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his rumpled trench coat, his eyes taking in every detail. He saw the overturned coffee cup, the scattered papers on the floor, the dark, ugly stain on the cream-colored carpet, and he saw the body of Julian Croft, still slumped over his desk, a silent, tragic monument to a life cut short. His partner, Detective Lena Hansen, a sharp, tech-savvy detective who was his polar opposite in almost every way, was already there, her tablet in hand. "Victim is Julian Croft, CEO of Helios Innovations," she said, her voice a crisp, no-nonsense counterpoint to the somber atmosphere. "Time of death is estimated to be between 9 and 11 p.m. last night. Cause of death is a single stab wound to the abdomen. The weapon, a letter opener, was found at the scene." Corbin nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the letter opener, still lying on the desk, now carefully bagged and tagged as evidence. "A letter opener," he mused, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Not exactly the weapon of a professional killer. A crime of passion, maybe?" Hansen suggested, her fingers flying across the screen of her tablet. "An argument that got out of hand?" "Maybe," Corbin said, though he didn't sound convinced. He had seen enough crimes of passion to know that they were usually messy, chaotic affairs. This scene, despite the violence of the act itself, felt controlled, almost staged. He began to walk around the office, his eyes scanning for anything that seemed out of place. He noticed the security camera in the corner of the room, its little red light conspicuously dark. "The camera's out," he said, pointing to it. Hansen nodded. The feed was rerouted to a loop of an empty office. The hack was sophisticated but not untraceable. "I've got our tech guys working on it. But it tells us one thing for sure. This wasn't a random act of violence. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Corbin's gaze fell on a framed photograph on a side table. It was a picture of Julian Croft and another man, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, broad smiles on their faces. They were standing in front of a dilapidated garage, the humble birthplace of what would become a global empire. "Who's the other guy?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Hansen swiped through her tablet. "Marcus Thorne," she said, "co-founder and COO of Helios Innovations. Croft's partner, his best friend, by all accounts." "Where is he?" Corbin asked, his eyes still fixed on the photograph, on the two young men who looked like they were on top of the world. "He's on his way in," Hansen said. "He claims he was at home all night. He has a personal emergency," he told the board. Corbin grunted. "A personal emergency," he repeated, a cynical edge to his voice. "Convenient." Marcus Thorne arrived an hour later, his face a carefully constructed mask of grief and shock. He was dressed in a simple, dark suit, his tie slightly askew, as if he had dressed in a hurry. He looked every bit the part of the bereaved friend and business partner. He spoke in a low, somber voice, his words laced with a practiced, almost theatrical sadness. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice cracking on cue. "I just can't believe he's gone. Who would do something like this?" Julian didn't have an enemy in the world. Corbin watched him, his expression unreadable. He was a master at reading people, at seeing the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. And he saw them in Marcus Thorne. He saw the way his eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting Corbin's gaze. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. He saw the way he held himself, a coiled spring of tension beneath a veneer of sorrow. "You and Mr. Croft were close," Corbin said, his voice a deceptively gentle prod. "We were more than close," Marcus said, his voice thick with a carefully rehearsed emotion. "We were brothers. We built this company together, from the ground up." "I understand there was some disagreement between you and Mr. Croft," Corbin said, his tone casual, as if he were simply making a casual observation. "Something about a deal with Omnicorp?" Marcus's composure flickered, just for a moment. A flash of something anger, fear, crossed his features before he quickly suppressed it. "We had a difference of opinion," he said, his voice suddenly guarded. "That's all. It was a business disagreement. It had nothing to do with this. But it was a heated disagreement, I'm told," Corbin pressed, his voice still soft, but with an underlying edge of steel. "There was shouting, accusations. We were both under a lot of pressure," Marcus said, his voice becoming more defensive. "We said things we didn't mean. It was nothing." Corbin let the silence hang in the air for a moment, a heavy, suffocating blanket. "Where were you last night, Mr. Thorne?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the pretense. "I was at home," Marcus said, his answer a little too quick, a little too rehearsed. I was feeling unwell. I went home early." "Can anyone verify that?" Corbin asked, his eyes boring into Marcus, searching for the lie. I live alone," Marcus said, his voice faltering for the first time. "But I can give you my security footage. It will show that I never left my apartment." Corbin nodded slowly. "We'll be sure to take a look at that," he said, his voice giving nothing away. The initial stages of the investigation were a frustrating series of dead ends. The hack on the security cameras was a digital ghost, leaving behind only faint, almost untraceable traces. The murder weapon, the letter opener, was a dead end, covered in the fingerprints of both Julian and Marcus, as well as half a dozen other employees who had handled it over the years. The employees of Helios Innovations were a tight-lipped, loyal bunch, all of them professing a deep admiration for both Julian and Marcus, all of them claiming to have seen nothing, heard nothing. But Corbin was a patient man. He knew that in a case like this, the truth was rarely found in the obvious places. It was hidden in the details, in the small, seemingly insignificant inconsistencies, in the whispers and rumors that circulated in the shadows. He and Hansen began to dig deeper, to peel back the layers of Helios Innovations, to look beyond the carefully polished public image. And they began to find things. Small things at first. A series of encrypted emails between Marcus and a rival company, discussing a potential merger that Julian had vehemently opposed. A series of large, unexplained cash withdrawals from Marcus's personal bank account in the weeks leading up to the murder. A secret meeting with a high-powered corporate lawyer, a specialist in hostile takeovers. Each new piece of information was another crack in Marcus's carefully constructed alibi, another chink in his armor of grief. The image of the loyal friend and partner was beginning to crumble, revealing a man who was far more ambitious and far more ruthless than anyone had ever suspected. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior accountant at Helios, a young, nervous man named David Chun, came forward. He had been too scared to speak up at first, afraid of losing his job, afraid of what Marcus might do to him. But his conscience, he told them, wouldn't let him stay silent. He told them about a secret project that Marcus had been working on. A project that was off the books, hidden from Julian and the rest of the company. It was a shell corporation, registered in a foreign country with lax financial regulations. And through this shell corporation, Marcus had been siphoning off millions of dollars from Helios, funneling it into a secret account. He was building a war chest, Chun said, his voice trembling. He was planning something big. A takeover, maybe, or something worse. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. The disagreement over the Omnicorp deal wasn't just a business dispute. It was the final straw, the catalyst that had pushed Marcus over the edge. He saw Julian's willingness to partner with Omnicorp as a threat, a move that would dilute his own power, that would expose his secret dealings. And so he had decided to take Julian out of the picture, to seize control of the company for himself. The greed was a motive, a powerful one. But there was something else, something deeper, something that Corbin had sensed from the very beginning. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the betrayal. It was about the years of simmering resentment, of feeling like he was living in Julian's shadow. It was about a friendship that had curdled into a toxic, all-consuming jealousy. Armed with this new information, Corbin and Hansen brought Marcus in for another round of questioning. This time, there was no pretense of sympathy, no gentle prodding. Corbin laid out the evidence piece by damning piece. The encrypted emails, the bank records, the testimony of David Chun. He watched as the color drained from Marcus's face, as his carefully constructed composure began to unravel. "You're a smart man, Marcus," Corbin said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You're a man who plans for every contingency. But you made one mistake. You underestimated us. You thought you could get away with it." Marcus's facade finally crumbled. The mask of grief and innocence fell away, revealing the face of a man cornered, a man with nothing left to lose. A sneer twisted his lips, his eyes burning with a cold, defiant rage. "He was a fool," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "He was a dreamer, a child who didn't understand the real world. He was going to destroy everything we had built. I did what I had to do. It was a confession, but it was more than that. It was a justification, a desperate attempt to rationalize an act of pure, cold-blooded betrayal. But there was no justification, no rationalization, that could erase the image of Julian Croft, lying dead on his office floor, a victim of a greed and a jealousy that had festered in the heart of his closest friend. The unraveling was almost complete. The hidden deals had been brought to light, the betrayal exposed. The police had their killer, their motive, their confession. The case, it seemed, was closed. But in the twisted world of high finance and even higher stakes, things are rarely as they seem. And there was one more secret, one more hidden deal, that was about to be revealed. A final, shocking twist in a tale of greed and betrayal that was far from over. The sun of Helios Innovations had set, but the darkest part of the night was still to come. The confession of Marcus Thorne was the bombshell that the city of Lumina had been waiting for. The news spread like wildfire, a torrent of headlines and breaking news alerts that painted a sordid picture of jealousy, greed, and cold-blooded murder. The story of the two friends who had built an empire, only for one to be brutally betrayed by the other, was a modern-day tragedy, a cautionary tale that captivated and horrified the public in equal measure. For the Lumina Police Department, it was a slam-dunk case. They had the killer, the motive, and the confession. The city could breathe a collective sigh of relief, secure in the knowledge that justice was being served. But for Detective Miles Corbin, something still felt off. The pieces fit together, but the picture they created was too neat, too simple. Marcus Thorne was a meticulous planner, a man who thought 10 steps ahead. His confession, a sudden emotional outburst, seemed out of character. It felt less like a genuine admission of guilt and more like a final, desperate move in a game that was far from over. His suspicions were heightened by a single, seemingly insignificant detail from Marcus's statement. When asked about the money he had been siphoning off, Marcus had been vague, almost dismissive. He had claimed it was for a contingency fund, a safety net in case the Omnicorp deal went south. But the numbers didn't add up. The amount of money he had embezzled was far greater than what would be needed for a simple contingency fund. It was enough to start a war, or to disappear without a trace. Corbin's unease was shared by his partner, Lena Hansen. She had been digging into the financial records of the shell corporation that Marcus had created, and she had discovered something that didn't make sense. The money wasn't just sitting in an account. It was moving, being laundered through a complex series of international transactions, a digital maze that was designed to be untraceable. "This isn't the work of a man who was planning a hostile takeover," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stared at her tablet. "This is the work of a man who was planning to run." The question was, what was he running from? The answer came from an unexpected source. A lawyer representing Omnicorp contacted the police. They had been conducting their own internal investigation into the failed partnership with Helios, and they had uncovered something that they believed was relevant to the murder of Julian Croft. It was a series of encrypted communications between Marcus Thorne and a high-level executive at Omnicorp. But these weren't negotiations about a partnership. They were a conspiracy. Marcus had been feeding Omnicorp sensitive information about Helios's proprietary technology, its financial vulnerabilities, its long-term strategies. He had been selling them the keys to the kingdom piece by piece. The Omnicorp deal, the one that Julian had been so eager to secure, had been a Trojan horse. Omnicorp had never intended to partner with Helios. They had intended to absorb it, to gut it, to leave it a hollowed-out shell. And Marcus Thorne had been their inside man. The revelation was a stunning, sickening twist. Marcus hadn't killed Julian to stop the deal. He had killed him to ensure that it went through. Julian, with his sharp instincts and his deep understanding of the industry, had been on the verge of discovering the truth. He had been the only one who could have stopped Marcus, who could have exposed his treachery. And so, he had to be eliminated. The murder of Julian Croft wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business decision. A cold, calculated move in a high-stakes game of corporate espionage. The greed, the jealousy, the resentment, it had all been a smokescreen. A carefully constructed narrative to hide a much darker, more sinister truth. Armed with this new evidence, Corbin and Hansen confronted Marcus again. This time, there were no emotional outbursts, no defiant sneers. There was only a cold, chilling calm. The mask had been stripped away, and the man underneath was a sociopath, a master manipulator who had played them all for fools. "You're a monster," Hansen said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and a grudging, horrified admiration for his audacity. Marcus simply smiled, a thin, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm a businessman," he corrected her. "And in business, there are winners and there are losers. Julian was a loser. The trial of Marcus Thorne was a media circus. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, with business analysts, with curious onlookers, all of them eager to witness the downfall of a man who had once been a titan of industry. The prosecution laid out its case with a chilling precision, presenting the evidence of Marcus's betrayal, his conspiracy with Omnicorp, his cold-blooded murder of his partner. Marcus's defense was a desperate, transparent attempt to paint himself as the victim, a man who had been pushed to the brink by a reckless, impulsive partner. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury was out for less than an hour before they returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was life in prison with no possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Marcus's face remained a mask of cold indifference. He showed no remorse, no emotion, not even a flicker of fear. He was a man who had made his move and he had lost. It was as simple as that. The fallout from the trial was immense. Helios Innovations, once the crown jewel of Lumina's tech industry, was in a state of freefall. The revelation of Marcus's betrayal had shattered the company's reputation, sending its stock price plummeting. Omnicorp, exposed for its predatory practices, was facing a series of lawsuits and government investigations. The gilded cage had not just been broken, it had been utterly destroyed. In the end, it was a story of a reckoning for Marcus Thorne, who would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a prisoner of his own greed and ambition. A reckoning for Omnicorp, whose ruthless pursuit of power had been brought to light, and a reckoning for the city of Lumina, which had been forced to confront the dark underbelly of its own success. But it was also a story of a strange, twisted kind of justice. In the aftermath of the trial, a new CEO was appointed to lead Helios Innovations, a woman who had been a protege of Julian Croft, a woman who shared his vision and his integrity. She began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding the company, of restoring its reputation, of honoring the legacy of its fallen founder. And in a final, ironic twist, it was revealed that Julian Croft, the man who had been so eager to close the deal with Omnicorp, had had his own suspicions. In the days before his death, he had started his own secret investigation into Omnicorp's business practices. He had been on the verge of uncovering the truth, of exposing the conspiracy that would have destroyed his company. His death, in a strange, tragic way, had been the catalyst for the very thing he had been trying to achieve. It had brought the darkness to light. It had exposed the betrayal. It had saved his company from a fate far worse than a failed partnership. The sun of Helios Innovations had been eclipsed, but it had not been extinguished. A new dawn was breaking, a dawn that was tinged with sadness, but also with a glimmer of hope. The city of Lumina had lost its golden boy, but it had gained a hard-won lesson in the true cost of ambition. The gilded cage was gone, but in its place, something new, something stronger, something more resilient, was beginning to grow. The reckoning was complete, and the long, slow process of healing could finally begin.